How a Cursed Girl Freed a Jinn and Found Redemption, a moral and spiritual tale. On a quiet hill at the edge of Bhavani village where not a single street light could be found, and the wind howled through the dry, dust-covered trees, stood a crumbling mud house that the villagers called the House of Sorrow. Inside that house, Leba sat on the rooftop, silently staring at the sky. There were no tears in her eyes, yet they were as deep as a bottomless ancient well, holding layers of memories so heavy with pain that there were no tears left to shed. She didn't cry. She didn't need to anymore. Pain that goes unhealed for too long becomes numb, like an open wound licked by desert wind, burning at first, then scarring over. At just 17, she had been married off to Fayez, a laborer who worked in the fields. It was a marriage without love, without laughter, filled only with sweat, tears, and burden. Her father had said, "You are a burden, Leba. Marrying you off is a release." But that release was never meant for her. Her husband, the only person left who could share a bowl of rice, a bed on a cold night, died beneath a banyan tree in the fields, after what seemed like a simple fall. Since then, her life had become like a white page, smeared with black pencil strokes, chaotic lines that had no end. That night, a strange wind passed through the house. It didn't carry the scent of earth or straw like usual, but instead, brought a strange aroma. It wasn't floral, nor incense-like. It smelled like cold ashes mixed with tears. Leba looked up. The sky was thick with stars, like thousands of eyes watching her. The wind rose, tossing her tangled hair, and then she saw a beam of light appear on the rooftop, slender, glimmering like shattered moonlight. From that light, a figure emerged. The face was unclear, but the eyes glowed with an eerie brightness. "Don't be afraid," he said. His voice was deep and smooth like flowing water, but cold, like the midnight wind. "Leba, I didn't come to harm you." She trembled, the hairs on her neck standing on end. "How do you know my name?" "I know all who live at the bottom of this earthly hell," he whispered. "And you, Leba, are one of them." Leba collapsed from dizziness, and when she opened her eyes, she was back in her room alone. No light. No trace of anyone. No one believed her when she told them what had happened. But then, everything began to change. A strange child appeared in the middle of the rice fields, his blue eyes as bright as crystal, his face full of sorrow. Leba gave him a piece of dry bread, and as soon as he finished eating, he disappeared into the fog, leaving behind a quiet emptiness inside her. That night, in her sleep, Leba dreamed of falling into a bottomless pit where children's laughter echoed from the walls. And then, she began seeing shadows. A figure standing beside her bed. Eyes watching from the kitchen stove. A hand resting on her shoulder at midnight, but when she turned around, no one was there. In the Earth Store Sutra, the Buddha said, "Sentient beings in Jambudvipa have minds that are constantly changing. They do little good and commit much evil. When they suffer, no one can save them except for their own compassionate heart." Perhaps Leba was walking through a hell on earth, a place where the last light in the darkness was faith in goodness. She didn't know. But she could feel it, something was watching her. Not to harm her, but to test her. At the far end of the village lived a blind old woman, alone. One day, as Leba returned from fetching water, the old woman called to her with a raspy voice. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Leba froze. "What are you talking about?" The child. With eyes like burning turquoise, "He does not belong to this world." "A ghost?" Leba whispered. "No," the old woman shook her head gently. "Not a ghost, and not a human either. He's A message. Leba didn't understand. But those words planted a seed of doubt in her already shattered mind. The days that followed felt like an endless dream. Leba lived as though her soul was no longer tethered to her body. From dawn until dusk, she went from house to house, doing odd jobs, sweeping, chopping wood, hauling water, like a hollow shell, repeating the same eternal loop. But it was only when night fell that everything truly began. Each evening, the mud roof above her head would come alive with voiceless whispers, vague sounds like the wind scraping through the throat of someone dying. She no longer knew what was real and what was illusion. She heard footsteps while washing dishes. She felt someone lightly touch her shoulder as she slept. She saw a figure standing outside her window, though nothing lay beyond it but a wall of dirt. One evening, while she was starting a fire to make porridge, her mother-in-law, a sharp-tongued widow with piercing eyes, suddenly screamed, "Are you trying to burn this house down, you cursed woman?" The old woman yanked the burning stick from the fire and began striking Leba. But just as the stick was about to crash down on Leba's head, it stopped midair. Nothing was visibly holding it back. Yet it felt as though an invisible force had frozen it in place. Then, a cold wind surged into the kitchen, scattering everything in its path and snuffing out the fire in an instant. The entire room fell into darkness. A familiar scent drifted by, the same mix of cold ash and tears she had smelled that first night. Her mother-in-law fell backward, hitting her head against the mud wall, eyes wide in shock, stammering, Something held my hand." Leba stood frozen, her heart pounding so hard she thought her chest might burst, not from fear, but because for the first time in her life, she felt protected. After that incident, things grew even stranger. Her sister-in-law, the one who had once accused her of being bad luck, of ruining her marriage prospects, began to suffer from sleep paralysis every night. She told everyone that something sat on her chest, suffocating her. They didn't believe her. But they were afraid. Children in the village started avoiding the house. Dogs howled at night as if they could see something humans couldn't. And yet, strangely, Leba, the one they despised, beat, and cast aside, remained calm at the heart of the storm. One night, Leba dreamed she stood before a burning mountain, the fire blazing red like the mouth of hell. At the peak sat a figure in meditation, surrounded by ashes and charred bodies. The person wore monk's robes, but their face was hidden in smoke. "Leba," the voice echoed as if from within her bones, "You are walking between two worlds. One is karma, the other is liberation. Which path do you choose?" She couldn't answer. But deep inside her, another voice whispered, "If one does not rescue oneself from the darkness, who will? Not even the Buddha can pull someone into the light if they do not wish to walk toward it." Leba jolted awake. Her forehead was drenched in sweat. But for the first time, her heart didn't feel as heavy. The next night, as she lay on the rooftop, the strange light appeared again. This time, the figure did not hide his face. It was a young man with sharp features and glittering blue eyes, the same eyes as the child she had met in the rice fields. You're the child," she whispered. "No, I am the true form of that soul. The child was merely a shape your mind could accept." "Who are you?" He didn't answer immediately. He stepped forward and gently placed his hand over her heart. "I am the one who heard your silent cries every night. The one who watched you pick up each piece of your dignity from the mud of this village. I didn't come to save you. I came to remind you that only you can save yourself." Leba felt her heart tremble. Not from affection, but from a newly born sense of belief. Kitagarbha Bodhisattva once vowed, Not until the hells are emptied will I become a Buddha. So long as beings suffer, I vow not to leave hell. Perhaps, the soul standing before her was one of those who chose to remain among the suffering to guide others. When she looked up, he was gone. Only the moonlight remained, spilling across the rooftop like a gentle, glowing presence. Something within Leba had awakened a quiet strength she never knew she had. Not a miracle. Not salvation. But a calling. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight touched the rooftop, Leba opened her eyes, unsure if it had been a dream or something more. A soft breeze carried that same cold, familiar scent. Something within her had changed, not that her burdens had lifted, but that now she had an anchor. As if an invisible presence stood silently behind her, offering support. From that day on, she began to notice the traces of the supernatural more clearly. When she passed the sugarcane fields, the leaves moved with her footsteps, not from the wind, but as though something walked beside her. When she walked past the old dry well where several mysterious drownings had occurred, a village child pointed at her and screamed, "She has a shadow behind her." Everyone turned. Leba stood still. No one saw anything but sunlight and her own shadow. But the child kept sobbing, unable to stop. At night, the dreams returned. But this time, it wasn't a burning mountain. It was a dark forest, where tall, leafless trees stretched upward, their roots tangled with shriveled hands reaching from the earth. Leba walked through the forest. With every step, a whisper echoed in her mind. Old karma unpaid, restless souls not yet at peace. Ahead, a cage hung between two trees. Inside was a human-shaped figure, its face blurred but the eyes looked exactly like hers. Leba screamed, "That's not me. I didn't do anything wrong." A voice replied, calm and cutting through to her core. No one walks through life without leaving footprints on karma. No one is innocent in the eyes of the heavens. She woke with a start, her body soaked in sweat, her mind echoing two haunting words. Old karma. The next morning, while chopping wood, she met the blind old woman, the one who had warned her about the strange child. Though she couldn't see, the woman knew Leba had arrived. "You've started to see them now, haven't you?" Leba said nothing. The woman continued, her voice deeper than before. "They've always been around us. They're not as far as you think. Every tear cried in injustice, every silent gaze, it all calls something forth." Leba asked, trembling. "What are they?" "They are shadows not yet freed. Karma not yet repaid. Wandering souls stuck between realms not of this world, but not yet departed from it." The old woman raised her hand and touched Leba's forehead with fingers cold as stone. "You were chosen not because you're special, but because once, long ago, you made a vow to save the lost souls." That sentence stirred something deep in Leba's subconscious. Had she made a vow in a previous life? Was this journey not something new but the continuation of an endless cycle? That evening, as she gathered firewood in the forest, a wild place the villagers rarely dared to enter, she felt eyes on her. It wasn't just a feeling. It was real. The shadows of trees stretched long, twisting like arms chasing her. When she stopped, everything went quiet. But when she moved, footsteps rustling leaves echoed behind her, matching her every step. She ran. Branches whipped her face and arms, stinging her skin. But she didn't stop. Until she tripped and tumbled down a slope, landing in a shallow pit. There she saw the child. This time, he didn't run. He stood still, his blue eyes gazing at her more sorrowfully than ever before. "What are you?" she gasped, on her knees, clutching her chest. The child didn't answer. But he raised a hand and pointed deep into the forest, where a small wooden house, covered in moss, sat cloaked in darkness. Leba followed his gaze, heart heavy. Something was calling her there. A bond from a distant lifetime. When she turned back, the child had vanished. In the Kitagarbha Sutra, there is a line. If one is lost in the three evil paths, a single thought of compassion will summon bodhisattvas to appear and guide the way. Leba didn't know who the bodhisattva in her life was. But clearly, some soul was guiding her. Maybe it was the child. Maybe it was the figure under the moon. Maybe it was the compassion slowly awakening within her. And now, she knew one thing for certain: there was no turning back on this journey. Leba stood before the moss-covered wooden house. The twisted branches above, like gnarled old hands, pointed toward the rotting roof, casting a chilling aura over the place. There was no door, only a dark opening, like the gaping mouth of a beast waiting for its prey to walk in willingly. She hesitated. But then, the wind howled again, this time like someone weeping, and her heart clenched. Though her legs trembled, she stepped forward. Inside, it was pitch black. The damp smell of mold mingled with the faint aroma of incense. Ragged cloths hung from the walls, thick with dust, as if time itself had fallen asleep in that room. In the center, an old mat stained the color of dried blood lay on the floor. Atop it sat a small clay statue shaped like a child hugging its knees, with no face. Leba looked around. No one. Yet the feeling that someone stood behind her made it hard to breathe. A voice whispered, not in her ears, but inside her mind. "You've been here before. You once made a vow." She stumbled back, her head ringing, as fragments of forgotten memory rose like smoke from dying embers. She saw herself, but it wasn't her. It was another woman, dressed in ancient robes, sitting in this very house, placing a hand upon the clay statue, whispering, "If I ever return, I will not let any soul be left behind. No matter what life they live." The vision faded. Leba collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. She began to remember. A piece of her soul had once lived here. Had once made a solemn vow. That night, as she returned to the village, the full moon shone through the tree branches, casting a cold silver light over her. She said nothing to anyone. But as she entered her house, her mother-in-law was waiting, eyes bloodshot. I know what you're doing in that forest," the old woman shrieked, hands trembling as she held a whip. "You're a witch. You killed my son. Because of you, this house is cursed." Leba remained silent. There was nothing left to explain. Every word had long been buried beneath fear and superstition. The woman lashed the whip across her back. Once, twice, 3 times. But on the 4th strike the whip snapped in half in midair. No one had touched it. There was no wind. It broke cleanly, as if sliced by an invisible blade. Her mother-in-law fell backward, eyes rolling, foam at her mouth. Leba didn't panic. She simply stared, feeling the unmistakable presence of someone standing beside her, not with vengeance, but with protection. Once again, she had been shielded. Later that night, she sat alone by the well. The moonlight shimmered across the water, and in the rippling reflection, she saw the blue eyes. "You again," she whispered. This time, the child's figure was no longer distant. He walked over and sat beside her as if he'd been waiting. "Why do you follow me?" "Because you once vowed to save those who have no one." "I'm just a weak woman. I'm not a Buddha. I'm no bodhisattva. The child placed a hand over her heart, just as he had in her dream. But you have compassion, and that is the one thing hell can never consume. Leba burst into tears. For the first time in years, her tears flowed not from fear, not from weakness, but because she had finally discovered her strength. Not everyone needs to be a Buddha. Sometimes, simply refusing to turn away from suffering is enough to be someone's light in the darkness of this world. In the Kitagarbha Sutra, it is written, "When one gives rise to compassion, all hungry ghosts retreat. When one dedicates merit, countless suffering souls find liberation." Leba had never recited sutras. But that night, as she returned to her broken rooftop, she sat down, lit a small oil lamp, and whispered, "For all those trapped between two realms, if the light within me is enough, may you pass through it and find your way home." That night, she was not alone. That night, there was no wind. No full moon. Thick fog blanketed the village like a funeral shroud draped over the body of the dead. Leba lay in bed, arms wrapped around herself, a creeping cold rising from her solace to her neck. There was no sound, but her heart pounded as if someone were knocking against each of her veins. Then, she drifted off. Not into ordinary sleep, but into a drifting state, as though her soul was gently being pulled away from her body. When she opened her eyes, the world had changed. No longer the mud walls. No longer Bhavani village. She was standing in an ancient square, lit by hundreds of lanterns floating in midair, glimmering like falling stars. Before her stood an old stone temple, its roof arched like a phoenix's wings, with gates carved in rotating chakras surrounding a lotus flower. On the temple steps, an elderly monk sat in meditation, his eyes half closed, his face ageless, strands of incense smoke weaving between his fingers like wandering clouds. Leba floated toward him, not walking, but drawn. The monk opened his eyes. "You've forgotten," he said, his voice soft as dawn's breeze. "You once sat here, in a lifetime long ago, when the wind had no name, and water no color." Leba gasped. "No. I'm not a monk. I'm just a poor woman. You are all of that and much more." The scene around her melted like wax beneath a flame. Then it reformed. This time, she was no longer Leba. She was a noble woman in a grand home, clothed in finery, gold bracelets clinking at her wrists, laughing among her servants. But her eyes were cold. Empty. One maid, frail and trembling, knelt before her, begging forgiveness for breaking a priceless vase. Leba, or rather, her former self, said nothing. She waved her hand. A guard stepped forward and hurled the maid into the muddy rain outside. The scene flashed again. The maid died that night, frozen in the cold. A wave of red light swept over the vision, erasing it. The dream shattered. Leba jolted awake, forehead soaked. She vomited into her hands, not from the dream, but from guilt so raw, it didn't come from her mind, it came from her soul. She gasped. "That was me, in a past life. I caused someone suffering." In the Kitagarbha Sutra, Lord Kitagarbha once said, "Beings fall into evil realms not by fate, but often from a single thought, a single misdeed, that ripples across endless lifetimes. To end the cycle, one must repent from the root." Leba understood. She wasn't being punished. She was being led to remember. To remember that everything she endured, abandonment, false accusations, haunting spirits, the cold wind without a name, none of it was random. It was the echo of suffering from souls she had once harmed. From that day on, she stopped cursing her fate. She walked through the village silently, pressing her palms together before those who had wronged her. Not to beg. but as a quiet apology to all of existence. She said nothing aloud, but her eyes changed. Her actions, cooking, carrying water, became slower, sacred, like a ritual cleansing the last remnants of her past deeds. She returned to the wooden house in the forest, this time, without fear. Before the clay statue, she placed a wildflower and whispered, "If I once sowed suffering, then today, let me harvest it without complaint. And if there are souls still wandering here, take this small light within me as your lantern to find the way home." No voice replied. But the wind shifted. For the first time, it blew in the opposite direction. Labor returned. But she knew the real trial hadn't yet begun. Because once the past is opened, the darkness will not let you go. It will test you to your very limits to see how many souls a single act of repentance can redeem. And whether you're strong enough to face the full truth. Leba didn't remember how she ended up back at the forest house. All she knew was that the past life dream had led her to a door she could no longer walk away from. The sky was dark. No moonlight. Only flickering flames lit the forest trail, as if someone had lit lanterns deep in the woods to guide her. Tree shadows stretched like hunting beasts. But this time, Leba wasn't afraid. She walked forward as if an invisible hand was guiding her step by step into the past. And then she saw it, a moss-covered stone door, hidden behind thick brush. On it was a strange symbol, a closed circle with two misaligned eyes inside. When her hand touched the stone, her skin stung like needles. She turned the handle. The door opened without a sound, releasing a cold breath like the exhale of a beast long imprisoned. Inside, a spiral staircase led downward. Each step took her deeper into memory, into guilt, into truths long unspoken. Beneath the earth, where no light reached, was a hollow chamber thick with the scent of blood and rusted iron. Chains hung from the walls, some still tangled with strands of human hair. On the ground, old blood stains smeared across the cold stone, as if someone had once tried to crawl their way out. Leba approached the back wall where a figure was chained. A man. Thin. Blank eyes. His body bound in iron shackles, mouth covered with a filthy cloth. She recognized him. He had appeared in her dreams, the one imprisoned for some dark ritual. She trembled. "Who are you?" The man opened his eyes. They were blue. She stepped back. "You're the child," she whispered. He nodded. A voice echoed in her mind. "I was once a lost soul. And you were the only one who ever offered me kindness, even if it was just a piece of bread and a gaze free of judgment." Leba's heart cracked open. "What's happening? Why are you locked here?" The voice returned. "I was once a jinn, a spirit made of fire and light. I was imprisoned by a man who used dark magic to bind me to this world. He turned me into a tool, a source of energy to feed the darkness. He was once a monk. But blinded by ambition, he betrayed the path. And he is the one you are about to meet." Before she could react, footsteps echoed from above. Cold. Measured. Unhurried, because he knew his prey had come willingly. From the staircase, a tall middle-aged man appeared, his face covered with a thin veil, dark circles under his eyes as deep as a well. He was the master of the abandoned mansion in the woods, the one who had hired Leba to clean the haunted house. The one who forbade her from entering the upper floor, and the same man she'd seen chanting before her own photo. He looked at Leba not with anger, nor fear, but with the calm of someone who had waited for this moment a long time. "So, you finally remember," he said, voice sharp as steel. Leba clenched her fists. "What have you done to him? You imprisoned a soul for years." "No, He cut in. I didn't imprison him. I protected him from his own nature. He's a jinn, the same creature who once annihilated an entire village over a single insult. I sealed him, to keep balance. Leba turned toward the chained man. His eyes weren't filled with rage. Only sorrow. He's not that creature anymore. No, the man agreed. But you know what happens if the seal breaks. You've seen it in your dreams. You've seen who you really are. Leba took a step back. I'm just a human. No, Leba, he hissed. You are the source of the energy that awakened the jinn. You and he are two halves of an ancient vow. If you free him, this world will pay the price. The truth shattered within her. All light and shadow never separate but always within the same being. In the Kitagarbha Sutra, the Bodhisattva does not punish fallen souls. He only asks one thing. Are you willing to turn back? And now, Leba had to choose. To continue living as an ordinary woman, or to risk everything, even her life, to free a being once called a monster, but who was also part of her own path. Choose, Leba, the man's voice echoed through the stone chamber, bouncing off the walls like a scream from the land of the dead. Free him, and bring ruin upon the world. Or leave him chained, to protect what little remains. Leba stood between two forces. On one side, the shackled man with sorrowful eyes, the jinn, the soul she once felt, once nourished with deep compassion. On the other, the guardian of the seal, a man who protected the world through his merciless restraint. She said nothing. But her hand slowly reached out and touched the blackened bronze lock clamped around the jinn's wrist. In that moment, wind ceased. Hearts stopped. The light within the chamber vanished. Then, a thunderous boom shook the ground like a storm erupting from deep beneath the earth. The chains shattered. Jinn collapsed, curling up like a creature shedding its worldly skin. His body glowed, veins erupting in molten light, like lava flowing beneath his flesh. The man in gray, the master of the mansion, staggered back, eyes wide in shock. You don't understand. You don't understand how powerful karma can be. Leba stepped between Jinn and the one who had imprisoned him. I'm not afraid of karma. Because I am part of it. She turned to Jinn, placing a hand on his chest, now trembling, his eyes blazing like fire. You are not darkness. You are light that was betrayed. Look at me. Look at me. Jinn raised his gaze. And in his eyes were 1,000 shattered memories. She saw a village engulfed in flames from supernatural fire. Souls of the dead crying out in the wind. Jinn, in a past life, summoned as a spirit of light only to be exploited and weaponized. And herself, Leba, opening the first gate. Not in this life, but hundreds of years ago. Leba cried out amid the fierce light pouring from Jinn's body. If in a past life I misused power to lead you into darkness, then today I use love to bring you back to the light. She embraced him despite his burning body. Red-hot welts formed across her arms, but she did not let go. And then, the chamber began to shake. Chains snapped from the walls on their own. The whispering voices from the stone faded first into weeping, then into prayers, until finally, silence, as if released. A cold wind swept through. Jinn slumped against her shoulder. His body calmed, like embers after a wildfire. The flames died down, and he became human again. No more aura. No more fire in his eyes. Just a man who had been forgiven. Cracks began spreading across the ceiling above them. The seal keeper collapsed to his knees, his face suddenly aged by decades. You don't understand. I had to lock him away, because you were the cause of all this long ago. Leyba stepped forward, her eyes calm. I understand. And because I understand, I won't run anymore. She placed a hand on his forehead, perhaps a blessing, or perhaps an ending. From today on, I will carry the karma I once created. Not with bitterness, but with transformation. The man looked at her one last time, then collapsed, like a statue crumbling under its own weight. When they emerged from the underground, daylight had broken. For the first time in days, sunlight filtered through the canopy, dancing upon dust motes like freed souls. Jin took her hand, saying nothing. No words were needed. Leyba gently closed her eyes, whispering the words of the Kitagarbha Sutra in her heart. May all those who have fallen into darkness find the light again, from even a single outstretched hand. Returning to Bhavani village, Leyba saw that everything was the same: dust in the air, narrow alleys silent as ever, and the villagers' eyes, still cold as blades. No one knew what she had gone through. No one had witnessed the explosion of light beneath the earth, nor the liberation of a soul bound for centuries. No one believed it, and no one needed to. To them, Leyba remained the woman who brought misfortune, the widow, the curse, the one whispered to have a shadow following her. She stayed silent. No defense. No denial. Because now there was no one left to blame. She returned to the old mud house, once both her home and her prison. Dust coated the walls. Everything sat where it always had. She climbed onto the rooftop where she had once cried alone night after night, and for the first time, she smiled. Not because everything was perfect, but because her heart had changed. The whispers of the dead were gone. The wind no longer carried the scent of ashes and tears. Only the soft chirping of birds remained, perhaps the first soul to finally pass on. A few days later, the blind old woman came. Still hunched, still leaning on a bamboo cane etched with a name scratched in by a fingernail, still carrying eyes that saw what the seeing never could. She quietly sat beside Leyba on the roof. They said nothing for a while. Then the old woman asked, "You opened the door, didn't you?" Leyba gave a slight nod. From her sleeve, the old woman drew a tattered cloth. Inside it was something small and round like prayer beads. "A soul like yours needs no weapons. No talismans. Just, keep this." Leyba unwrapped it. It was a teardrop-shaped crystal, clear as glass, with a swirling white flame inside. "What is this?" "The essence of remorse. Something not everyone has the courage to carry." Leyba held the stone. A warmth spread through her hands, not burning like gin, nor cold like the dead, just gentle. Like a compassionate hand reaching out to someone who had fallen. The old woman added, "You may leave. Or stay. But whatever path you choose, remember this. Once a soul has awakened, it must never return to blindness." Leyba didn't respond. But she knew. It was time to live, as someone who carried old karma not in guilt, but in love. Rumors spread across the village that Jin, a stranger with glowing eyes, was now living with her. The villagers were suspicious. Some mocked. Some watched from a distance. But every time someone approached the house, a strange wind pushed them away. Something was there, not evil, not holy, just the power of peace. Jin didn't speak much. He never walked through the village. But each night, the light from Leyba's house glowed like a small candle, enough to quiet the insects, enough to push away bad dreams. And then something miraculous happened. One morning, while Leyba was in the kitchen, she suddenly felt a wave of nausea. Panicked, she spoke to the old midwife, who smiled softly. "You're pregnant, Leba." Leba froze. Not because she hadn't wished for it, but because she had always believed she was born of misfortune, that she could only bring loss. And yet now a new life was forming inside her. A soul not bound by karma, but born of compassion, of forgiveness, of a journey where darkness had been met with light. That night, Leba sat atop the rooftop, hand resting on her belly. "Did you know," she whispered, "your mother was once someone who caused pain. But she learned how to say sorry. How to carry what she'd done, and my child. If one day you find yourself lost in the dark, remember. Light is not in the sky. It's in your heart." Above them, a single shooting star streaked across the heavens. No one saw it, except for Jin standing behind her in silence. Like a quiet thank you, wrapped in moonlight. When the morning light touched the roof of that tattered house for the first time after countless days of darkness, Leba was no longer the cursed girl, the abandoned woman, or the one haunted by shadows. She was now someone awakened. A person who had once sown wrong, once lost her way, but had the courage to admit it, take responsibility, and turn darkness into light. In the Kitagarbha Sutra, it is written, "Beings in the land of Jambudvipa have minds that are unstable. Doing evil is easy, doing good is hard. But even a single wholesome thought brings the protection of Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and heavenly beings." So why was Leba, a woman who once lived in ignorance in a past life, now protected? Because she didn't run from karma. She didn't blame others or curse her fate. She chose to carry the burden she had once created and then transform it with compassion. She didn't seek salvation from outside, not from gods, not from miracles. She turned inward, where the light of Buddha nature quietly burned beneath layers of pain, shame, and loneliness. As Leba placed her hand over her growing belly where a new life blossomed, she smiled gently. She no longer feared the world. She no longer feared karma. She no longer feared wandering souls. Because she now understood. Every pain is a lesson. Every grudge is a reminder. And every lifetime is a chance to return, to begin again, and to become a small light in the vast darkness of this world. In the final vow of the Kitagarbha Sutra, the Bodhisattva declares, "Until the hells are emptied, I vow not to become a Buddha. Until all beings are saved, I vow not to leave the realm of shadows." Leba's story, what seemed like a tragedy, was in truth a living vow brought to life in the ordinary world. She chose to stay with the darkness, to ignite the light within herself and those lost around her. Speech balloon. And what about you? Are you carrying a burden, an old wound, an unforgiven mistake, a past you cannot release? Are you willing to pause, turn around, and step out of the darkness through compassion, through honesty with yourself? Sparkles, you may not be a bodhisattva, but you can be a small candle. Enough to light your own path. And enough for someone else to see that the way out is real. Movie Camera, thank you for joining us today. We'd love to hear from you. Backhand index pointing right. Leave a comment below and share one thing you've learned today and how you plan to use it in your life. Your thoughts truly matter to us, so don't hesitate to share. Open book reading your comments gives us great strength and encouragement. If you enjoyed this video and found it meaningful, please thumbs up, like, bell, subscribe, outbox tray, share it with friends and loved ones. Growing heart, your support helps us continue creating inspiring, meaningful content, bringing stories of humanity and Buddhist wisdom closer to everyone. Folded hands, thank you for watching and walking this path with us. We hope to see you in the next video. Homage to Kitagarbha Bodhisattva. Namo Kitagarbha Bodhisattva.